Yang berbahagia Datuk Sri and Datin Sri, Yang berbahagia Datuk and Datins, distinguished speakers, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the co-hosts, Worldwide Fund for Nature Malaysia and the British High Commission in Malaysia, as well as the Boston Consulting Group, BCG, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to part 2 of this two-part Facebook Live event, Nature-Based Solutions Towards Better Adaptation and Resilience from Climate Risks, a collaboration between WWF-Malaysia, the British High Commission in Malaysia, and the Boston Consulting Group. I'm your host, Gary Thessera, representing Climate Governance Malaysia, and once again, CGM is very pleased and very honored to be part of this event. Ladies and gentlemen, in part 1 of this series on Monday, His Excellency Charles Hay, British High Commissioner to Malaysia, graced us with his welcome remarks and outlined the UK's commitment to supporting action to address climate change. And to that end, launched the first of the 2 animations aimed at raising awareness on climate impacts and the need for governments, the private sector, and communities to adapt to the impacts of climate change. We also heard from our 2 distinguished panelists. First of all, Professor Joy Pereira from the Southeast Asia Disaster Prevention Research Initiative, SEEDPRE, at University Kebangsaan Malaysia, or UKM, particularly in her capacity as Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, Working Group 2 on Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability. And we had her unpack for us the contents of the recent IPCC report on the changing profile of climate change risks, particularly as they impact developing countries, as well as the heightened need for governments to urgently undertake risk assessments in terms of the key economic areas and infrastructure that may be exposed to climate impacts. Also, what adaptation measures need to be explored to prevent loss and damage. We then heard from our second distinguished panelist, Mr. Joel Kwong, a partner at Boston Consulting Group, and his focus on climate and sustainability. And he shared his experiences working with numerous corporates and governments regionally, particularly on ESG topics, including charting national pathways and developing climate policies to achieve net zero emissions targets. Ladies and gentlemen, in the second of this 2-part series, we will delve deeper into the challenges and opportunities afforded by nature-based solutions. And to help us in our understanding, we have with us 3 distinguished panelists whom I will introduce later. But before that, allow me to once again thank the British High Commission in Malaysia for financing the development of these 2 animations, the first of which you saw on Monday, and the second which will be launched today. And with that, may I invite the Secretariat to play the second of the 2 animations sponsored and supported by the British High Commission in Malaysia.
Climate change and environmental-related disasters are becoming more prevalent, threatening lives and livelihoods. Incidents such as floods and droughts are happening more abruptly, and their intensity has increased well beyond historical norms. In our first video, we introduced nature-based solutions offered by terrestrial and marine ecosystems, which are able to address social, economic, and environmental challenges such as food security, water security, climate change, biodiversity loss, disaster risk reduction, human health, and socio-economic development. We saw that nature provides so many solutions to today's challenges and plays an essential role in the global effort to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In this episode, let's explore how NBS are meaningful to communities, economic activities, and livelihood. Look around us. The places we live in can feature NBS. Urban landscaping around us, such as parks, streets, walkways, drainage, and ponds, can be designed as green infrastructure to enhance societal well-being while meeting environmental needs. These forms of urban nature-based solutions can contribute towards cooling cities, mitigating floods, and providing recreational spaces for better physical and mental human health, whilst also helping to conserve urban biodiversity. WWF-Malaysia is working with a timber and palm oil company in Sabah who had experienced conflict with elephants. Elephants, of which there are less than 1,500 left in Sabah, had been causing damage to their crops, with costs amounting to around RM500,000 in 2012. With WWF Malaysia's help, the company created a wildlife corridor through their oil palm plantation, connecting two forest reserves with restoration of native trees and allowing elephants through mature areas of their plantation. Now, the cost of crop damage from elephants amounts to only RM5,000 annually. This project draws tourists wanting to see elephants, who in turn motivate the plantation workers who are proud that their work is creating a draw. The company's international reputation also grew, allowing them to attract more buyers. Nature-based solutions are often an inherent part of communities' lives for those living in the non-urban areas. In Sarawak, WWF Malaysia is working closely with the Jagoy Heritage Forest communities to support the community's management of the natural forest and conserve the Jagoy Bidayu cultural heritage. The Jagoy Heritage Forest serves as a catchment area for 9 water supply systems in the community of 11 villages. It is rich in flora and fauna and also serves as a carbon sink. Degraded habitats here are restored through planting of native trees, and the extraction activities are restricted to non-timber forest products with the harvesting of fruits from several community fruit forest groves. Another nature-based solution is to restore degraded habitats. At Bukit Piton Forest Reserve in Sabah, WWF Malaysia runs a forest restoration program by planting native trees, which has generated positive outcomes. The once degraded forest is now home again to a thriving population of orang-utans. Added to this, the forest ecosystem services are being restored, including the ability to absorb and store more carbon. The local community also benefits from trading in seedlings, which provides local business opportunities. Nature-based solutions contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in an integrated manner by addressing people, planet, and profit coherently. We can thrive if we protect planetary health and build our economies and livelihoods harmoniously with nature. We all need to be advocates for nature-based solutions. Will you join us?
So once again, a big thank you to the British High Commission in Malaysia for helping support the preparation of those two, the second of the two animations, the first of which we saw on Monday. Do look out for a link that will be posted at the end of this event, which will allow you to access some of these materials. Okay? Let's get to our panelists this evening. And before we do so, though, let's go through a few house rules. First of all, we'd like this to be as interactive as possible, and so with the Facebook page through which you're watching this Facebook Live page, there should be a comment section where we would welcome your questions. Kindly identify yourself so that we can direct the questions properly, as well as perhaps direct your question to one or more of our panelists. The organizers will then make the questions available to the panelists and myself as I moderate, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. On to our first panelist. Ms. Thulaja Thessa Vasudevan is a climate policy analyst at Bank Negara, Malaysia. She's been there since November 2019. She's a member of the Sustainability Unit at Bank Negara and works on developing financial sector policies and initiatives to address climate and environmental risks. She's worked on a joint research project with the World Bank on exploring nature-related financial risks in Malaysia, and is a member of the NGFS Inspire study group on biodiversity and financial stability. Thessa holds a Master of Science degree in Nature, Society and Environmental Governance from the University of Oxford, and an LLB law degree from SOAS University of London. So with that, may I ask the Secretariat to put Thessa's slides on the screen and Thessa to make your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gary. It is a pleasure to be here today, and I'm so grateful to WWF, the organizers, for inviting me to speak at this really important event. I actually managed to catch day one of the discussions that proceeded with Dr. Joy Pereira as well as Joel Kwong's presentations, and I thought it was a fantastic and rich discussion. And I thought perhaps before I get into my presentation proper, I wanted to reflect on two things that I thought was very related to what I wanted to speak on today. The first key takeaway for me from the session 2 days ago was how adaptation is simply not an option, right? And it's really critical to our response to climate change. And I think the theme of integrated responses being necessary if we were to even stand a chance of tackling such an urgent and existential threat such as climate change, this understanding of integrated responses flows through in the study that we've done at Bank Negara and the World Bank. So the second key takeaway that really struck me from the previous discussions was on loss and damage, and how the costs of climate change and the destruction of ecosystems are already materializing. It's already widespread. They matter now, at present, and they will matter more so in the future if we continue to ignore these problems that we are already facing. So I think with that, Welton, perhaps you might want to bring up slide 2. Yes, okay. So this is really the starting point for why Bank Negara Malaysia started to look at nature-related risks, and the idea that there are broader risks besides climate change that we need to start paying attention to. We started with this recognition that the loss of nature and climate change are deeply interconnected. And Dr. Joy gave us a very clear picture on how biodiversity and ecosystems are already severely being impacted by climate change. And on top of that, we also know that there are other drivers such as deforestation, pollution, overfishing, and land use change, which are putting a lot more pressures on biodiversity and our life-supporting ecosystems. So these pressures translate into concrete real-world impacts that we are seeing today, which are happening at a much faster rate and are more widespread than we anticipated even 20 years ago. So this kind of this understanding from the science made us within the financial sector, us at BNM, but also BNM, we've been working with the larger central banking community, the NGFS, internationally to study some of these risks from nature loss. And we realized that climate change isn't a standalone issue that is relevant to the financial sector. The loss of nature, which is happening all around us, and the interactions from climate change and nature loss is important for us to take into account from at least two perspectives. The causes of both these crises is interconnected, and the solutions and the responses to these twin threats are also interconnected. So take, for example, deforestation, the burning of peatlands and tropical forests. This type of activity has already shifted some areas from being carbon sinks, which are crucial for climate mitigation, into carbon sources. So we're releasing more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and this will obviously have an impact on our ability to adapt and be resilient to climate change. So as the nature-based solutions video presented earlier also mentioned or very clearly depicted, conserving these kinds of ecosystems is also a massive opportunity to tackle both of these twin challenges and to tackle and really take seriously the social and environmental dimensions of sustainability in an integrated manner. So with that in mind, Bank Negara Malaysia, we wanted to build our own capacity. We wanted to build our ability to understand the broader risks from the loss of nature, how the financial sector could be implicated with these risks. And I really want to emphasize that this is a massive learning exercise for us at BNM. And we're really glad for us to have kicked off this study as a stepping stone towards more concrete actions in the future. So maybe next slide, Welton. Thank you very much. So this slide is to try and answer the question, how is the financial sector linked to nature? What you see is a summary of how we understand this relationship. in that nature provides us with ecosystem services, which are essentially the benefits that we get from the existence and maintenance of natural assets and ecosystems. The economy depends on these ecosystems to run. And at the same time, we know that economic activities also impact nature. The overexploitation of natural resources, pollution, waste, etc., affects the provision of these ecosystem services. And the thing about these services is that it's strongly linked to productivity of various sectors of the economy. Now, a World Bank study actually estimated that in a worst case scenario of partial ecosystem collapse, Malaysia could experience a 6% annual GDP loss by 2030 compared to a baseline scenario. Such a loss would be driven by a decline in export demand and negative impacts from the partial collapse of forestry and fishery ecosystem services. So these losses can transmit to larger macroeconomic impacts, which could then also affect the financial sector. And there is that feedback loop between the financial system and the economy. The exact channels, the magnitude of this feedback loop is quite uncertain at this point. We don't yet have the kinds of models and data that would enable us to map out or capture the complexity of these interactions and the non-linear kinds of impacts. So this goes beyond the analysis presented in this report. But the focus of this study is really to provide a first understanding of the exposures, which mainly comes through this relationship of a double materiality between nature and the financial sector. So the essence of it here is banks, through their lending to economic activities, are affected by what happens in nature through this dependency and impact channel. And this is really the basis for our thinking on how do we start to look at impacts and risks from the loss of nature to the economy and the financial sector. So this is really what Bank Negara and the World Bank was collaborating on to try and unpack within this joint report. Next slide, please, Watson. So similar to, and one of the main conceptual basis for this study is also that we realize, similar to climate-related risks, nature-related risks can lead to economic and financial losses. And what do we mean by nature-related risks? We refer to them as a broad set of risks that include ecosystem services, biodiversity, and natural assets such as water and forests. And ecosystem services, that might be a sort of a technical term, but generally we broadly define them as benefits that people obtain from ecosystems, such as regulation of droughts, floods, land degradation, the provision of crops, fresh water, aquaculture, and timber. And so how we try to map this in terms of the relationship between the financial sector and nature loss is that physical risk could emerge from the loss of these ecosystem services that business activities depend on. And these dependencies could be direct, for instance, a decline in fisheries for the aquaculture sector, or it could be indirect via supply chain impacts and the price changes. So think of higher food prices when you have a loss of crops, for instance. Physical risk could then also be triggered by, I think the ecologists in the room would probably be able to explain this better, but the slow onset loss of ecosystem services, such as reduced agricultural yields, or sudden onset events like the triggering of an ecological regime shift, for example, the eutrophication of a lake. So because the loss of nature interacts with climate change, and frankly, I think it's difficult really to tease out where the line is between one and the other, the sort of precautionary approach that we're taking is to acknowledge that physical risks could be compounded by both trigger events. And at the same time, we also know, I think many of us in the room and in the audience would also have a keen eye towards this, on how businesses can impact biodiversity and ecosystem services via the excessive use of natural resources and the ways in which we dispose of our waste, the ways in which we use land and deteriorate land. So sudden changes in policy, technology, and consumer preferences in response to these impacts could then trigger transition risks to businesses and financial institutions who are funding them. So these pressures could come from domestic changes as well as changes in important export markets. For example, for Malaysia, we're already seeing how the EU is increasingly regulating risks from deforestation to their market, and there is obviously an impact on our ability to export to these markets. So the degree to which these types of nature risks emerge for the financial sector depends partly on the availability of substitutes for the depleted ecosystem services, as well as the ability of firms, the business activities, the businesses themselves, and the ability of banks to adapt in a timely manner. But really, the key takeaway from this slide, and what we've understood even from this study, is that if we don't anticipate these risks and if we don't take action earlier, sooner, and in a measured and sort of in a measured and proactive manner, the sectors with high negative impacts on biodiversity could face, write-downs in their asset valuations. Businesses could also see higher liability claims arising from the impacts and the dependencies on nature. So for financial institutions, this adverse impact on how businesses that they are lending to may be affected by the loss of nature, and the profitability of these businesses could then translate into what we typically see as credit underwriting, market, operational, and liquidity risks. So next slide, please, Watson. This slide is meant to visualize how we examine this relationship. We use the OnCore database, which is a global database available for free use to the public. And what OnCore allows us to do is to map the sector-based impacts and dependencies on ecosystem services for various sectors of the economy. We use BNM's anonymized bank lending data to economic sectors, and our data sample consists of around 733 billion Malaysian ringgit, which makes up about 90% of the total lending to corporates and SMEs. And the focus of the analysis is on the relationships between economic sectors, the ecosystem service, and the ecosystem services with only high and very high dependencies only. This is because the degradation of those kinds of ecosystem services is the one that's likely to have a stronger detrimental impact on the firm's business processes. So likewise, only linkages with high or very high impact scores are considered when we assess the transition risk exposures. So this mapping actually is not very straightforward because it consists of several steps of data reclassification and remapping from bank lending data to the OnCore database. And what I wanted to mention here is also that really for those who are not very familiar with how we tend to go about doing these analyses within the financial sector, the kind of data needs to conduct this analysis is really quite substantial. So I think this was one of the biggest learning points from our exercise at BNM, is that we realize for even for us to assess climate-related risks in order to then take measured and concrete actions to tackle that, we are facing very similar data challenges. And this report and the next couple of slides where I will be explaining the aggregate results from this analysis should be read in that context of data limitations. So next slide, please. Okay, so this slide shows the dependency of bank loans on ecosystem services. We investigated about 15 ecosystem services with quite substantial differences in the amount of exposure that the banking sector has to vulnerable economic sectors. So there's a few that stand out. As you can see on the chart, these include surface water, climate regulation, which surface water has about 29% of loan exposures, and climate regulation has 26%, and flood and storm protection to 16% of the total loan portfolio basically are exposed to these sectors that could see that basically, should there be an impact to these ecosystem services, these are the Malaysian banking sector would be exposed to the risks stemming from these particular ecosystem services. So taken together, 54% of all commercial lending of Malaysian banks is to economic sectors that depend highly or very highly on at least one of these ecosystem services. This is equal to about 398 billion Malaysian ringgit, or 94 billion US dollars. And I think, for us, we do deem this as quite substantial or enough of an amount for us to take this seriously, and to recognize that, okay, this is really a good start for us to continue digging deeper and try to understand what can the Malaysian banking sector do about this. Next slide, please. All right, so we also looked at the sources of potential transition risk for banks by analyzing lending to sectors that contribute to the deterioration of ecosystem services. So this is the second materiality element from the previous slide I mentioned regarding the relationship, the double materiality relationship. So this is on the impact channel. So the negative impacts on nature related to economic activities. And here, we see that the largest transition risk factor would be greenhouse gas emissions, which is, thankfully the financial sector is already moving on this, but this is, something that I guess validates our focus as well on why BNM as well as Securities Commission has been working very closely with the financial sector to mobilize climate action. So 60%. More than 60% of bank loans are directly or indirectly exposed to ecosystem deterioration due to greenhouse gas emissions. And we also see other risk factors such as water use, which is 56%, and land use, which is 43%. The point here is that should there be increased regulation, for instance, this can affect the value of firms active in the sectors such as forestry and agriculture, because these are the sectors that are very closely linked to the kinds of ecosystem services you see here on this slide. And it would also impact firms that are part of these supply chains. So all in all, there's about 87% of commercial lending of Malaysian banks that could contribute negatively to nature in one or more dimensions. This is equal to about 639 billion Malaysian ringgit. So this shows that there is a broad-based impact that economic activity can have on nature, and that the financial sector may also have indirectly through their lending to these economic activities. The next slide, please. Okay, so besides individual risk factors, we also tried to identify a first set of more comprehensive scenarios where we asked the question, which events could be particularly relevant for banks in Malaysia? We find that the most important scenarios are related to the introduction of climate policies. It's also related to deforestation and water stress, besides a more general scenario of broad-based deterioration in ecosystem services. So these are the list of scenarios to which the banking sector has the highest exposures to. And in terms of the sectors where we may want to think about more given their exposures, these would be real estate, agriculture, the manufacture of food products, and accommodation. So sectors that are vulnerable in a wide range of scenarios, but actually constitute a smaller fraction of where banks lend to. These would be sectors such as forestry, fisheries, and tourism. But these are still, sectors that are very, very vulnerable, and we also need to pay attention to what could the macroeconomic and the financial sector impacts be from scenarios where there is a loss of these ecosystem services in these sectors. The next slide, please. Okay, so besides looking through a sectoral lens, we also look at spatial analysis in our study. So we try to basically map key biodiversity areas in Malaysia and loans by banks, and we try to identify which loan or where the loans would potentially be vulnerable to future policies that are trying to protect areas that are currently not protected. This is within the context of the discussion on at the Convention on Biological Diversity, where there is efforts to increase the size of protected areas. So for now, it appears that the direct exposures of banks to these areas seem to be limited, but bear in mind that we do have quite a few data limitations, and we will need better spatial data to be able to track and monitor the loans to these vulnerable or protected areas. So the conclusion of the study really is that, next slide please, Watson. Nature and the financial system impact each other through economic activities. Malaysian banks are potentially exposed to a variety of nature-related risks, and do need to build on this exploratory study, which could improve with better data as well. But really, for us, at least at BNM, we've been able to identify a list of potential actions that we can take preliminarily. Next slide, Wilson, which is basically the same roadmap that we would take as when we started to address climate-related financial risks, where we start by raising awareness, policy discourse, to enhance capacity building and engagements, to strengthen macroeconomic surveillance capacity and risk identification, as well as to develop supervisory and regulatory expectations. I think perhaps I'm running out of time, Dr. Gary, but do I have time for the last slide, or do you want me to wrap up?
Now go ahead with the last slide. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Dr. Gary. All right, the last slide. So these are some examples. These are some examples of what we mean by the 4 areas I mentioned earlier. So I think this kind of knowledge dissemination, this kind of knowledge sharing events where we can disseminate the report findings is quite important. We're also still obviously working with the government to ensure that nature-related financial risks are to be considered in the relevant policies. We also have plans with the JC3, which is the Joint Committee on Climate Change, where we want to start looking at, how nature-related risk can be incorporated more concretely in the initiatives there. We are obviously also taking internal steps to enhance our technical capacity to understand how to look at these transmission channels and the interactions between climate and nature risks, improve existing data, that's a big one. And of course, with all of these initiatives, we do plan to develop supervisory and regulatory expectations in the near future. But of course, there are these fundamental key steps that we need to start taking first before we get there. So that is a summary basically of the report that we worked on, and I'll close there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thessa. It's a very, very rich presentation. And I'm sure that the audience will be more than keen to find out more about some of these regulatory guidelines, perhaps, that Bank Negara Malaysia is going to be putting out. Of course, thank you also for joining the dots, as it were, between the issue of climate change, the natural ecosystems, and humans, human economy, and human livelihoods, and the linkage to the banking system, which I think the financial system, which I think is very, very important. Also, thank you for outlining the physical risks and distinguishing them from some of the transition risks. So I believe that you have a healthy list of questions to deal with when we come to the Q&A period. On to our second panelist this evening, Professor Gopalasamy Reuben Clemens is a conservation scientist by training. He is currently the Associate Dean of Research and Postgraduate Studies in the School of Medical and Life Sciences in Sunway University, and a Senior Fellow at the Jeffrey Sachs Center on Sustainable Development. Prof. Reuben received his PhD in Conservation Science from James Cook University and obtained his Master of Science and Bachelor of Science in Biology from National University of Singapore. He's published over 90 articles, including some in Nature magazine. His work has been featured in the BBC, the New York Times, as well as National Geographic. Reuben's team has worked with the Terengganu state government to create legislation gazetting 30,000 hectares of protected area, now known as Kenyer State Park. And a lot of his work is now focused on developing conservation finance mechanisms. And here, once again, the link to financing to fund the management of existing protected areas and protection of threatened forests. Prof. Reuben, let me allow you to begin your slideshow.
All right, thanks very much, Gary. I'm going to share my screen now. Yeah, it's a wonderful talk by Thessa. I learned so much. Thanks, Thessa. I think I'm so hopeful that the banks are taking it seriously. I think now more than ever, I think we have a lot of support from the private sector to support our nature-based solutions that we have been trying to do for the last 10 years in Kenya. So the title of my talk today is called Kenya for Life. And what we're trying to do is to really secure the future of forest, wildlife, and people living in a 200,000 hectare watershed in Kenya and Terengganu for life. So it's not just for the life of animals and people, but we want to get sustainable financing and ensure that the solutions are implemented for a long, long time. So my name is Reuben. I'm currently at Sunway University as an associate dean. I'm a professor there, but I also have been before that been involved in the NGO world. Many moons ago, my wife and I, Dr. Shima, and I were actually part of WWF. And WWF, again, thanks for having me on this webinar. It's nice to see some familiar faces. And we worked there for quite some time. After that, we decided to set up our own NGO, and its name is called RIMBA. And at RIMBA, we were trying to provide a platform for young Malaysians to lead projects that would develop evidence-based management recommendations to really help conserve wildlife throughout, mainly in Peninsular Malaysia. Right now, RIMBA has closed, but we have incubated 4 new NGOs, and I'll tell you a bit about one of them. It's called Nature-Based Solutions. But one of the projects in RIMBA back in 2014 involved a lot of implementing nature-based solutions, which dealt with trying to manage populations of 3 big cat species, the Malayan tiger. You can see here resting in in front of one of the camera traps in Taman Negara, Terengganu. We also tried to see how populations of leopards and cloud leopards were doing in collaboration with Perhelitan. And Perhelitan we worked closely with, and we managed to assist them in arresting more than 36 poachers. And poaching is a problem, but biodiversity loss to some extent was due to an influx of Indo-Chinese poachers. Here you see here a Vietnamese poacher coming to the forest. After this, potentially setting snares, and these snares trap animals like this, and the wildlife parts are eventually brought back to places where the demand is in Vietnam and China. And so we were really concerned. And on the ground at that time, I was just a bumbling conservation scientist trying to see how we can come up with solutions to mitigate biodiversity loss. And well, the most important thing at that point in time was to get more boots on the ground. So we reached out to Perhelitan, and together with a few donors from the US, Panthera, Woodland Park Zoo, and the US Fish Wildlife Foundation, we managed to get funding to get Orang Asli rangers on the ground. Again, tapping into the knowledge of the indigenous people is how we managed to navigate this rough terrain. They were good at looking for signs of not just wildlife, but also for poachers. And eventually, we helped reduce the poaching, and that led to more tigers persisting over the next few years. It's an example of how really indigenous communities were involved from the start to try to provide long-term solutions to ensure that we still have biodiversity in the area. Another issue that we found while we were doing our work there was logging. Again, this was a Hutan Simpan, a forest reserve. Here you see a tongkang here where logs are eventually loaded onto this. And what struck us when we were working in a forest reserve, that it was actually not really well managed. And again, one of the nature-based solutions involved managing forests well. Again, it's not easy for forestry department. There are places where perhaps logging concessions do not adhere to the rules and regulations, but as a result of improper logging, you get all this sedimentation here you see next to the lake in Kenya. So once you have all this sedimentation going into the lake, it also impacts the other water catchment services. It affects flood regulation and also affects businesses. So TMB, of course, doesn't want too much silt going into the lake, because then it affects their turbines, and then you don't get clean energy or efficient energy being produced. So this improper logging that we saw was an issue, especially when it was actually taking place in a 10,000 hectare proposed wildlife sanctuary. And this is actually one of the corridors identified by the Central Forest Pine Master Plan. It's called Primary Linkage 7. So we were quite disturbed with this. So we started to talk to the Terengganu state government, and over time, we worked with the Terengganu state government to create a 30,000 hectare state park. Eventually, this was done. This is actually the size of Penang Island. You've been to Penang Island, that's the size of this park. And again, thanks to my team of wonderful Malaysians. There were 30 over Malaysians involved in this team, in this whole efforts. And we managed to now have this Kenya State Park protected. And we work closely with the Terengganu state government to ensure it's sustainably managed and financed over the next few years. So this is what it looks like now. Please come and visit us now that we are free to travel. We also right now work with a lot of orang asli to try to develop trails there, and we're just starting out implementing the management plan. So, as I mentioned, as a small NGO in Rimba, we started out in 2010. One of the projects, which is called Harimau Selamanya, was mainly trying to protect big cat species, but now we also sought to protect this fantastic carbon sink, which we now know as the Kenya State Park. And as I mentioned, we are now closed in Rimba, but we have incubated 4 new NGOs and so non-profit organizations, one of which is Nature-Based Solutions, the non-profit social enterprise, and I'll tell you more about what they do. And Kenya for Life is really about 4 main things: about biodiversity conservation, climate change mitigation, empowering local communities, and trying to improve the management of the Kenya State Park. So that's going to happen. It's been happening since 2021. And I'll tell you about more where this project is. It's the map that shows the Kenya catchment. The area in pink here is the 30,000 hectares that's been now protected. Our dream, our goal is to get the entire area sustainably managed, and this is what we aim to do in the next few years. So why invest in Kenya? If you're a business, as Tessa pointed out, a lot of businesses are being impacted because especially their financing activities that are resulting in climate change. So why invest in Kenya? Because old is gold. There's a lot of old Heterocarp forests there lying in Kenya, and some famous scientists like Dr. Greg Esner, he's responsible for a lot of LiDAR imagery in Sabah. He, according to his research, has found that Southeast Asian forests store more carbon per hectare than anywhere else on the planet, so even much more than the Amazon. So places like Kenya, this is where you want to invest money in, because old growth Heterocarp forests are also fantastic at really sequestering carbon. We cannot afford to keep logging these areas, which will start to release more carbon. And we also have local indigenous communities there. We have the Samak Berry as well as the Batik using the resources in Kenya. And you want to empower locals to manage your assets, and this really helps to minimize investment risk in the long term, because they become long-term stewards of the place. And indeed, this is May here, who's got one of the non-profits, the Rimba incubators, Takop, and she's been working closely with the Batik to try to get them involved in the co-management of the park, get them involved in as park rangers, even in creating new trails, and then they're actively trying to see how we can involve orang asli in ecotourism opportunities. It's a beautiful rafflesia flower you see here, and this is just one of the many attractions in the Kenyan State Park. So there are communities living there, and that's why it's worth putting money to ensure that money goes to the right people. Also, not forgetting the biodiversity, not just for tigers. We have all of Malaysia's terrestrial large mammal species there, and as well as more than 290 species of birds living there. So these are some of the fantastic camera trap images that we have got on our camera traps over the last few years. So clearly a very important wildlife refuge. And who are the partners implementing nature-based solutions? First and foremost, we cannot do this without the support of the Terengganu State Park Management Council, a new body that was formed to manage the state park. So they're looking to collaboratively managing this area, not just with NGOs, but with universities and the local communities who have been really involved right from the start. So there have been a lot of workshops that Rimba and NBS have held and brought orang asli leaders to the workshops where we actively sit down and find out how we can co-manage the parks more effectively. And this is just another one of the non-profits that sprung from Rimba. Panthera Malaysia, a local branch office of the New York-based Panthera, to try to help reduce biodiversity loss. They're the ones still out there with the rangers, helping pelitan, keeping poachers at bay. And they have been doing this for quite some time. They're still doing this, and not just in Kenya now, perhaps potentially other areas in Peninsula Malaysia. We also have other non-profits, Gaia here, who's focusing on the conservation of hornbills. Dr. Ravinda Kaur and her husband are working together with local communities, not just in Sabah, but also now in Kenya, trying to restore nest cavities, to make sure hornbills are there as well. And we're also looking to try to make sure that the flying gardeners, hornbills, as well as flying foxes, keep providing ecosystem services such as pollination and seed dispersal to ensure the forests remain healthy. And Takop, this is one of the social NGOs that we have developed together with May, and May is also trying to really learn from the indigenous communities how we can manage, because they've got so much knowledge over the years, and we need to tap into their rich history to see how we can better manage the watershed. And also Justice for Wildlife Malaysia, led by Dr. N and Sai, both of them from Rimba. They are trying to improve the legislative trying to improve the policies in the park. Then we have a state park policy enactment that allows the Gazette of the State Park. It's called the 2017 Terengganu State Parks Enactment, trying to find gaps and also helping the Terengganu State Park Management Council get better at prosecuting poachers. And there's a lot of work to be done. So Justice for Wildlife Malaysia is really all about trying to provide justice for animals, for the wildlife, and it's still ongoing. So again, we are inviting not just these implementing partners, but others who want to join the ride, who want to join the journey in Kenya, please reach out to us. We're welcome and open the collaborations. So on to the third part of the presentation, Hutanomics. So how are we doing this? How are we sustainably financing the work in Kenya? We are about trying to make sure that NHB solutions are able to proceed in the long run through long-term funding. And Hutanomics, well, as you can see the word here is about the economics behind forest conservation. There's a word coined by Dr. Tajang, part of RIMBA, and we got funding from the UK PAC. Again, thanks to UK PAC for kickstarting this project, which aims to develop frameworks to enable private sector investments into nature-based climate solutions for Terengganu. And over the last few years, we've received a lot more support and funders along the way, and there's still more coming in. So that's really exciting. But the main beneficiaries are the Terengganu state government, and they've actually set up a green financing task force to look into how we can fund all these nature-based solutions over a long period of time. So this is chaired by the State Economic Planning Unit. This is probably the first ever green financing task force in Peninsular Malaysia, and Terengganu is leading the way. So this task force really serves to bring in private sector stakeholders as well as NGOs and universities and local communities to try to develop green financing solutions. So these green financing solutions have been being developed for some time. We've explored it under MBS and RIMBA. We are basically trying to get private sector funding flowing to support all our goals there. And initially, we talked to the Conservation Finance Alliance back 2 years ago. They gave us a Kickstart grant to try to see what kind of solutions can be developed for the area. So, for example, if you're looking at return-based investments, we initially explored a debt instrument. We looked at developing a forest sukuk or forest bond to try to fund forest conservation in Kenya. But initially, we talked to the state government about it, but they were not so keen. But never mind, we moved on. We also looked at how we could use perhaps a payment for ecosystem service scheme developed with TMB, because they are actually renting the lake, but we need to get also hydroelectric company to pay for the water catchment services. So that's still something we're still exploring. We, of course, have to look for grants and other kinds of assistance from philanthropic organizations. That's still ongoing. As I said just now, we have been still being supported by philanthropy, but it's not long-term. These are all short-term grants. But we also have to move long-term into the businesses and markets to provide us long-term funding, maybe via the voluntary carbon offset market. We are exploring that at the moment as well in Terengganu, as well as looking at oil palm sector to improve their supply chain resilience. And a lot of oil palm companies, for example, are trying to pay for ecosystem service outcomes, and there are some investors who are interested in this as well. So we're talking a whole suite of people at the moment. At this point in time, there's also potential ecological fiscal transfer from the federal government to the state government. Maybe that's going to happen soon. We're not sure. We'll see. There are also a lot of blended finance vehicle opportunities out there. Big family offices who may want to work with places like Terengganu to develop long-term blended financing solutions. But ultimately, all these what's key is really a public-private partnership, and this is something we've developed over the last few years with the Terengganu state government. So I'm encouraging any of you in the audience to come and work with us. These are the founders of NBS. As I said, I'm not alone. I have a wonderful team of colleagues here with different kinds of expertise in finance and project development. So Dr. Tajang Jinggut, he's the one that's he's the project lead and he's the project developer at the moment, trying to come up with a very nice project for the Kenya. It's not just for Kenya as well, but we're looking at other states. And if you're looking at trying to estimate carbon credits, for example, we have the knowledge, we have the tools, and we are at the moment trying to secure green financing opportunities, not just in Kenya, but other parts of Peninsular Malaysia. So again, reach out to us for exploring the three things. If you want to understand the potential of your landscape, if you have a big landscape in Peninsular Malaysia or even in other parts, like in Borneo as well, if you want to see how voluntary carbon project could work, we could potentially give some high-level numbers of carbon credits, and that you might want to explore potentially to help fund your nature-based solutions in your landscapes. But we're also very always keen on partnerships, not just with state governments, but also the private sector as well as local communities. And we want to ensure that all these projects comply to the highest of certification standards. And we're trying to help our stakeholders, our partners, ensure their project safeguards in place. We also do outreach, and as I said, in the UK PAC funded program, we have been working closely with the Terengganu state government, coming up with webinars and on why it's important to mitigate climate change. Especially, we've come up with some videos in Terengganu dialect as well to engage government officers over the last year or so to understand what green financing is and what nature-based solutions are. Again, very hearty congratulations to WWF for coming up with such wonderful videos. I'm looking forward to all these videos as well in other languages, in VM especially. I think that's on the plate. And research at Sunway University, again, I'm open to accept postgraduate students who are keen on researching on MBS solutions with me. So just drop me an email if you are interested in those aspects, or if you want to find out more about how MBS can assist you in your landscapes, you can email Dr. Tajang. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Prof. Reuben. I mean, we all know that what is required is an ecosystem, a healthy ecosystem, providing all the stakeholders in an environment that is capable of supporting end-to-end action on the ground. It's very heartening to see a real-world example of such an ecosystem in place, involving not just indigenous peoples who actually are very familiar with forest ecosystems, but also moving to state governments, stakeholders, and also all the way to international funding agencies, even from foreign governments that have stepped up to be a part of this ecosystem, bringing together the finance with the nature-based solutions. I'm sure that a lot of our viewers will have questions for you on that. Moving on to our third panelist this evening, Mr. Tommy Cheo has been with WWF-Malaysia for the last 6 years. He joined in October of 2016 as the Integrated Ocean Management Conservation Officer. So what we'll do is we'll move from the terrestrial ecosystems to the marine ecosystem. Tommy graduated from the University of Tasmania with a master's degree in marine conservation, as well as a graduate diploma in aquaculture, and he's worked at the Seahorse World in Tasmania, which is a seahorse aquaculture facility, after graduating, before returning to Malaysia and joining the marine program at WWF Malaysia. Tommy, the floor is yours. Will you put your slides up and begin your presentation?
Hi everyone. So I'm Tommy. I'm the Integrated Ocean Management Officer for WWF Malaysia, and I'm based in Semporna. So after a journey through Kenyir and the forest, I'm going to take you through another journey underwater to Mabul Island, which is based in Semporna. So this project I'm going to share with you is actually a nature-based solutions that we are currently doing together with the youth and community in Mabul Island. So Semporna is actually in Sabah, and it's also part of the Coral Triangle. So the Coral Triangle is the marine version of the Amazon. So it's rich in biodiversity. There's almost more than 500 species of corals that can be found here, and it plays a very important role as a carbon sink. Not only that, it also provides economic opportunities, especially to tourism and also to the fisheries industry. And in Semporna, actually Mabul Island is one of the famous place for recreational divers. There's a lot of dive sites here, and it's really, really interesting. However, according to a research done by UMS using the CVET to actually categorize the different areas, how vulnerable are the islands and coastal communities to climate change. And Mabul Island and some of the islands in Semporna are actually categorized as highly vulnerable towards the impacts of climate change. So, and Mabul Island is actually the island with the highest density of population compared to the other islands in Semporna. So a lot of these climate change impacts actually really affects their livelihood and also survival on the island due to coastal erosion causing loss of property, and also the lack of fresh water due to saltwater intrusion into their wells. So, and also a lot of unpredictable storms and monsoon seasons. We actually managed to using LEAP, the local early action plan, we actually enter Mabul and understand how these impacts actually affected their livelihood and survival on the island. So then after that, we also approached them to ask what are some of the solutions and adaptation and also resilience that can be offered, and to work towards to increase the adaptability and also the resilience of the community towards climate change. So this actually from the report of that was done by UMS and WWF-Malaysia in 2015. So as you can see, that little square in the bottom there, that's actually Mabul Island, and it's actually considered as highly vulnerable. So that is why we focus a lot of our climate change adaptability and resilience in this island. So from that, we actually conducted a IKLIM leadership program or a training program where we provide the youth on the in Mabul Island the opportunity to be trained in climate change awareness, communication training. We also taught them how to do scientific surveys such as bridge profiling, coral monitoring, coral health monitoring, seagrass monitoring, etc. Also, they were also exposed to social surveys where it was the youth themselves that actually conducted the surveys to understand how the water restrictions and the intrusion of salt into their wells affected their lives, and how do we come up with a solution for it. Other than that, we also provided open water training to not all of the youth that was involved in this training, but only to a small group due to costs, and also coral restoration. So all this training, it was actually funded by GFSGP, and also just recently, this group has also received funding from Kepkas Sabah, the tourism ministry, to continue some of the nature-based solution works such as coral restoration, and also some of the trainings. So as you move on into some of the coral restoration work that the youths in Mabul are actually conducting. So this was actually done in front of one of the resorts. So we use the spider frame, which is we call it the spider frame, but it's actually just iron rebars that we make, and it has about 6 legs. So we attach corals to it and using cable ties, and a lot of this work were actually done by the youth in Mabul. We only invited trainers, and also WWF-Malaysia were also part of the team to mentor these youth. So that in the future, they will be, actually not in the future, just this morning, with the funding from Kepkas, they just installed they started the deployment of further 50 frames in Mabul Island, just starting this morning. The previous project, there was only 20 frames that under GFSGP, we only deployed 20 frames. So what we did was we looked for a site where there was no connectivity, it's just all sand. So we also make sure that the area meets most of the criteria to ensure that the survival rate of the corals that we restore there will be as efficient as possible. So with that, we placed 20 coral frames in that site, and in just 1 month, we see a lot of fishes started to use the area as a nursery. There were a lot more juvenile reef fishes. We even see juvenile moray eels coming in to look for a place to be their habitat. So it was really, really exciting. And in December 2022, we did continue our monitoring, and there was a mortality. There was only very low mortality rate. There was a 81% survival rate in December 22, so that was very promising. And it wasn't until this year, February 22, when we continue our monitoring progress, it drops down to 58%. So a lot of the coral fragments that we used during this project was actually the coral fragments that was, some of the corals were actually destroyed when there was a case of a barge hitting the reefs last year in Mabul Island. So WWF-Malaysia, together with Green Semporna, were invited to conduct the damage assessment, and with the report that we do that we sent to the government, they came up with this new fund to assist the youth on Mabul to continue this coral restoration project. So over here is one of the videos that the technical team can help me play, so that we can have a look at what was done underwater. This was done last year when we just started the coral restoration project. So thank you so much. As we move on to the slides again, so I hope you enjoyed that little journey underwater. So as we move on, we do see some small achievements. There's actually an increase in live coral cover after the implementation of that coral restoration project. However, due to the location of the site, where corals need a lot of currents to actually survive and grow healthily, but unfortunately at the same time we have problems such as marine debris and stuff like that coming in. So that is why there was a drop in survival rate between December 2021 to February 2022 due to a little plastic pollution and also other trash. So that's all for the coral restoration project that the local youths in Mabul are actually conducting. And to solve the problem with their freshwater issue, we have a different group of youth that have also been trained to conduct survey on water safety together with the officers from the water department. So they conducted a training, and a lot of the result of that survey, actually the waters in the wells are actually unsafe for drinking purposes. So the community were encouraged to only use the well waters for washing purposes and not for drinking to avoid health problems. So a lot of these households, due to the problem with their fresh water, they can spend between 3 ringgit to 10 ringgit a day per household for drinking water. So that can be a very big expense just for water alone. So the youth on Mabul actually also come up with a solution to install tanks. These are huge water tanks so that they can harvest the rainwater, and rainwater after it's boiled is actually safe for drinking. So they will be conducting in the future crowdfunding and also fundraising events for water tanks. So the plan was to get a few houses to share one big tank so that there will be enough water for these households and to save their money on drinking water, because it's actually a necessity and it's very important for their survival on the island. So as I end, we do know that humans may be the source of a lot of problems, but it is also humans that can also be part of the solution. So I encourage everyone to be part of that solution and to make a difference, so that there will be a future for our future generation. They will still be able to enjoy hiking, diving in these beautiful places. So I would like to end with one of my favorite quotes from Mother Teresa. We ourselves feel that what we are doing is just a drop in the ocean, but the ocean would be less because of that one missing drop. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tommy, for that very, very interesting presentation. And it's nice to have two of the panelists actually showing very, very clearly the link between communities and community livelihoods and their extended well-being, their quality of life, how it's actually linked to the ecosystems that eventually they end up protecting and preserving, which can actually be a source of their own livelihoods as well. Once again, if you have any questions for our three panelists, please put them in the comment section of the Facebook Live, and they will be passed over to us so that we can pose these questions to our panelists, and welcome the panelists with me on the screen. And we already have some interesting questions. We've got one from Ms. Nosrat Ravichandran. And this is a question that's directed to Thessa. It's a question that actually occurred to me the moment she ended the presentation. But the question from Nosrat is, will there be some regulations on financial lending to extract, and this is specifically to extractive industries that are causing large-scale, irreversible forest landscape damage, such as activities like quarrying, mining, dams, etc. So that's a question from Nosrat. Do you want to take a stab at answering that, Tessa? Go ahead, please.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Gary. Thank you, Nosrat, for that question. So I have to say that we're not quite yet in a position to develop more explicit supervisory and regulatory or regulations on any particular industries. But I would say that what we're already starting to do is to get financial institutions to pay attention to harmful economic activities. And I think we've sort of not taken specific we've not gone through the route of issuing specific sector-based regulations because we are aware that there's a lot of considerations for an economy such as ours, and how do we work with various other stakeholders besides the financial sector regulators on implementing potential regulations that are directed towards specific economic sectors. So there's larger economic considerations, developmental considerations, and also from a sort of a practical point of view, there are limitations for us to be able to track and monitor as well if we were to issue very explicit regulations on these sectors at this current time. So instead, what we've done is we've released a policy document called the Climate Change and Principles-Based Taxonomy, which helps FIs think through how to assess their lending to economic activities and the impacts of these activities on climate and environmental objectives. There's a clear principle of doing no significant harm to the environment here, which requires an economic activity to protect healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, irrespective of what sector the activity is operating within. And together with the financial industry, we've also issued more guidance for specific sectors to help them and enable them to better conduct these impact assessments. And these are the value-based intermediation, financing, and impact assessment framework, the VBIAF sectoral guides. And this really helps financial institutions to look at specific, measurement and metrics that they would need to assess when they are when they are issuing loans, and how they continue to track the progress of their current clients and customers in transitioning to more sustainable practices. Apart from that, we've also issued something called the Climate Risk Management and Scenario Analysis discussion paper. So it's a exposure draft currently. So we're still in consultation for this document. But essentially, this is meant to give out more specific requirements on how financial institutions are meant to manage their risks from a governance perspective, from a strategy perspective, from a risk management perspective, from how they go about conducting scenario analysis, and how their activities would be implicated with businesses that may have more harmful impacts on nature, etc., and also to the ways in which they disclose on this information. So I think what we're trying to say is there are lots of moving parts which we also need to work on before we get to a point where we are ready to issue very specific sector type of regulations. But at this point of time, what we want to do is build capacity of the financial institutions to be able to assess, to monitor, and to report on their business processes, and how then at the same time we're also, I guess, working with various other stakeholders alongside the Joint Committee on Climate Change. We are working with government stakeholders to explore, what other levers from the government side that we can use in order to manage some of these activities within Malaysia. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tessa. Yes, very good to hear about the climate change principles based taxonomy, and I'm sure that there are members of the audience who'd like to know a little bit more about that guidance document, that as well as the VBIF. But I'd like to switch to our two other panelists now and direct some questions there. I think for both of the panelists, perhaps. In terms of implementing nature-based solutions on the ground, what would be the challenges that you would normally face? I mean, you've mentioned some of them before in the presentation, but perhaps in more general terms, what would be some of the challenges that you would face, and what are some of the ways in which your teams managed to overcome some of these challenges? Can we start with Prof. Reuben? Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, great question. If I can think of three main challenges for me and our team, it could be probably the sheer size of the terrain that we are working in. I mean, logistics is crazy. Trying to get people into the forest, for example, just to catch a poacher is not simple, and to try to navigate the undulating terrain, we had to probably overcome that by hiring a lot of good orang asli from the area. Again, tapping into the indigenous knowledge and their skills and to try to navigate the forests successfully, to show where the animal signs, where the poacher signs are, and working with them, developing the trust. And even now, the orang asli who are there are actually reporting back to us, where poachers are, so we can let the wildlife department know where to catch them. So navigating the terrain and it's just such a huge landscape was probably the biggest challenge for the team. Second would be, I think, trying to get political support. And if you don't have political will to do all this in the area, it's kind of tough. So over the years, we managed to develop a very close relationship with the government, and we have people talking to the government, going for meetings, engaging them, going for the teh tarik session, for example, and also luckily getting support from the Istana as well, engaging the Terengganu royal family, trying to let them know why we should address these threats and why we should have a protected area in Kenya. And once you have the political will and support, I think it's a lot easier for things to move on the ground. And I think that's probably true for all NBS projects. If you don't have support from the government, it's going to be really tough to implement what you want to do, as well as the local community. So luckily or unluckily, there are no permanent local communities inside where we work. They're living at the fringes, but unluckily, because you don't have long-term stewards of the area always there. But as I said, we are working with orang asli communities who are living at fringes, who are using the resources in the catchment, and so that's why over the last few years they've become our allies and helping to manage the whole forest, reduce biodiversity loss. And lastly, I think something that we're trying to do through nature-based solutions, Sdn Bhd, is to develop long-term financing. Funding has been the main challenge. Getting grants, it's not sustainable. This is one of the reasons why Rimba closed, because year-to-year grants from donors is not sustainable. So we realized that at the end of 10 years, we decided to call it a day. It's really tough finding money, managing the money, reporting the money from pittance, really. And private sector has a lot of money there, and we are at this moment in time trying to engage private sector to provide long-term funding so that good people on the ground don't have to worry year to year on supporting themselves. And through long-term funding, perhaps potentially through a voluntary carbon project that could potentially allow the good people on the ground to keep doing the work to ensure that we have protection of our ecosystem services and not worry about the funding from year to year. So for me, these three things, like the terrain, the political will, as well as the funding, have been the biggest challenges. And thankfully, we are overcoming them, but still a lot of work to be done.
Thanks so much, Prof. Reuben. Just sort of maybe projecting some of the questions that might come. Are there any particular frameworks for payments for ecosystem services or performance-based payments or any carbon credit frameworks that you're currently working with? within the Kenya State Park system that perhaps some of our listeners in the private sector might be interested in? And if you think about that, maybe I'll come back to you with that question a little bit. Can we move now to Tommy? Perhaps the same question. What were some of the challenges? I mean, in your case, the linkage between the local communities and their livelihoods is much more direct. They are in the area. They probably are fisher folk as well. What would you describe as some of the challenges that you and your team faced? Thanks. Tommy, you're muted. Can you unmute first? Thank you.
Right, sorry. So thank you so much for the question. So even in the marine sector, we actually have the similar problem as Prof. Reuben. So yes, logistics, because Mabul is actually quite about 1.5 hour boat ride away. So to move trainers and also those steel frames, it's a big amount of money. Other than that, yes, the long-term funding is actually an issue as well, because a lot of the trainings is not just 1 or 2 times based. We have to conduct the trainings long-term, develop a relationship with these youths and also the community in Mabul to earn that trust. So we cannot just, just come in, do our work and leave. So you need to have that trust with the community. So the good thing is WWF-Malaysia has been working a long time with the youths. I think hearing from previous officers that work in my position 8 years, 10 years back, some of them that are involved in this project were actually little boys and girls in those times. So it's since that time. So that's why they have that that awareness already. So it's a lot easier to come in with that when they already have that mentality. So that's really awesome, because we've seen some of these kids actually change throughout the training sessions. Yeah, so that's really exciting. So thank God, yes, it's an obstacle, but at the same time, due to the success and also hard work from the previous officers, it makes some of these obstacles a lot less scary for me to conduct these nature-based solutions on the ground.
Thanks so much, Tommy. And perhaps if you could, I'll be coming back. Just a time check. We are at 5:22 right now, and according to this, we have a few minutes left. But I'd like to try to get another round of questions in, if I can, before asking the panelists to give us some of their concluding thoughts, and then go to the closing of this event. But I think it seems to me like the frameworks generally are in place for the implementation of some kinds of transfers of finance for ecosystem services. And the big question maybe is how seriously are the players in the financial sector taking these risks, which is then being transformed, I guess, into a kind of willingness to pay for these ecosystem services. Perhaps that's a question that I would like to first put to Thessa, and then if either Reuben or Tommy would like to answer that, I'll give you a slot as well. But yeah, in general, what's the current level of willingness? Is there money out there looking for solutions, or is it still a challenge, to find players in the financial sector looking for outlets for green financing? Thessa?
All right, thanks, Dr. Gary. This is I'm going to try my very best to try and answer this question, but honestly, I personally think that the financial sector are taking these risks seriously, but there are varying levels of readiness, number one. So you've got the big guys who are, probably ahead of the game, more advanced. And then you have in all honesty, as with many other sectors, not just the financial sector, not just with these types of stakeholders, with various kinds of stakeholders, there are people who want to do something about it but are constrained by capacity, by resources, by a lack of knowledge, by a lack of understanding on how to translate or use these frameworks in order to provide the kinds of financial solutions that are needed by people like what Tommy is doing, what Professor Reuben is doing, the kinds of initiatives, the on-the-ground initiatives that are going out, that are already present in Malaysia. There, I think, is still a lack of awareness on these types of projects. So we've had conversations with FIs who still tell us that even if we're able to identify projects, we're not quite sure how to then measure outcomes of these projects and tie it to the financial sector, incentives and the ways in which they track financial flows and the impact of these flows. So that's one thing. But despite that, I would say, at least from the work that BNM is trying to do, and also what we're doing with the Joint Committee on Climate Change, piloting and sort of exploring new kinds of financial instruments and funding solutions to meet the needs of nature-based solutions. So obviously, we can't be giving up just relying on loans and typical kinds of financial sector loans to fund for projects such as this. This will require different kinds of funding structures and mechanisms, and this is an area that even globally, I don't think many financial systems have grappled with or have understood how to tackle the challenges such as those I mentioned earlier, like data monitoring, tracking, being able to also work across disciplinary differences, or so from a finance person within the bank, how they engage with people who are working on the ground in some of these projects and translating what these biodiversity and ecosystem outcomes are to financial types of metrics and information. That's also a challenge. So these are, I guess, some of the sort of the broader picture challenges that we are trying to work through with frameworks and more tools to support the kinds of solutions that are needed to fund these activities.
Yeah, thanks so much, Thessa. And actually related to that, we do have a question from K. Rosarina Kasim. And this is actually about the VCM platform that's being set up by Bursa Malaysia. Perhaps, of course, no one here is from Bursa, but perhaps you could think about that while I extend this previous question to Prof. Reuben. And let me change the question slightly, because I think it's moving into a situation of, what's needed? So perhaps Reuben and Tommy, if you could perhaps very quickly explain what kind of financing and what kind of projects you would like the financial institutions and the financial sector to help you to finance, that would perhaps be slightly more amenable in terms of measurable goals and outcomes and results. That I think that would help with the clarity for the audience. Can Reuben go first? Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, so right now, for example, the Kenya for Life project, we have 4 main outcomes. We want to ensure that if we do develop a voluntary carbon project, we want it to be certified the highest standards. And right now, the VERA CCB certification is something that we're aiming for. And if you do get that, then potentially companies who need to purchase carbon credits to offset their emissions could buy carbon credits generated from forests. And that's something that can already happen because the state owns the forest, the jurisdiction lies with the state, forest belongs to the state. So if there's a willing buyer, that could happen almost immediately. There's no need, for example, right now the question posed by K there for VCM to be market to be set up, because we're talking about someone buying the credits, potentially retiring the credit, and not necessarily trading it. That could really happen, because for us, we want the forest to be protected so that the state government also gets funding from that without chopping the forest down. So that could really happen. And that to me right now seems to be a priority, trying to get funding from potential carbon off-taker to finance that. But that's just one option, because we did the math, and sometimes carbon alone, might not be able to save the forest, because the logging opportunities forgone might actually be much higher. And so we're looking at other kinds of financial mechanisms. And for example, right now there are investors out there who want to pay for ecosystem service outcomes. So that kind of funding could also be very attractive, coupled with potential carbon credit generated from that project as well. So these are some ideas. These are some potential mechanisms already out there in the public, which we are keen on, because that will enable financing of a large landscape, and potentially the state government gets sufficient revenue and not to pursue further logging. Just for earlier question about the frameworks available, again, we are just trying to help the state governments develop their own subnational frameworks through this UK-PAC project. And as I said just now, it's really illegal to go ahead and do it. It'd be nice if the state government comes up with a climate change policy and other kinds of regulations to ensure there are safeguards. But as of today, it can go ahead, but we will try our best to ensure that these safeguards are in place with the state government. And payment for ecosystem services, unfortunately, well, it's kind of tough. There are examples in Perak, for example, where Perak Forestry is getting some funding from micro hydro dams at the moment, but we don't have a PES policy out there that could facilitate more of this happening. It's again willing buyer and willing parties that will be involved. It'd be nice, like for example in Vietnam, they have a payment for ecosystem service decree where hydro dams are actually paying, but we don't have that yet here, and hopefully that will change in the future.
Thanks, Prof. Reuben. I'll get to Tommy in a second, but just to let everyone know that I'm coming back to you with about your closing thoughts on this. So we'll have a last go around. Tommy, of course, there is this issue of blue carbon as well, and we all know about seagrass, the potential of seagrass meadows to sequester, as well as the high sequestration rates of mangroves. Is there anything like that in the areas that you are working? Tommy, once again, you need to unmute. Yeah.
Hi, sorry. Thank you for the question again. So yes, there is still a lot of opportunity in not just in Semporna, but also in other areas in Malaysia as well, because blue carbon is still a new thing. Marine research and marine science is also still there's still a lot of knowledge gap. So there is a lot of opportunity still, especially in the marine environment kind of nature-based solutions. There's also a lot of success stories. So that there is positive hope that it can be done in Malaysia as well. So even in Semporna itself, it's just not just nature-based solutions. We also fighting against human threats, such as very direct threats such as fish bombing and overfishing and many other kind of threats as well, to actually increase the resilience of not just the community, but also for the marine environment as well, by removing these threats.
Thanks so much. And we are actually out of time, but we'd like to hear closing remarks from all of our panelists. Can we begin with Thessa, please? Some brief closing remarks, take homes.
All right, thanks so much, Dr. Gary. So I would say I've learned a lot from this discussion myself, and I think one point is clear. It's that there's lots of challenges, sure, when we're trying to work across sectors, across different industries. But I think the point just made by Tommy, which is that there are success stories. There are plenty of nature-based solutions projects already ongoing in Malaysia. And I think for the financial sector, our takeaway is that we need to start increasing our own awareness of these projects. Number one, we need to start speaking to people on the ground and really being very much in touch with the kinds of local and nested solutions, and working directly with communities and grassroots organizations, such as what Professor Reuben as well as Tommy is working on currently. So if there's one thing that I would leave the audience, especially if there's any financial institutions listening to this call, I would say, let's continue talking to some of these fantastic types of stakeholders who are doing work on the ground, and let's see how we can continue working together with them.
Thank you, Thessa. Prof. Reuben, your closing remarks.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Thessa. So for me, it'd be three things, I guess, to take home to ensure that we continue ensuring that nature-based solutions are effective. I would say maybe some lessons learned from the recent NCA case in Sabah, that transparency is key. With transparency, that involves really, as I mentioned, talking to the local communities. In our case, we have from the start involved the government, and we had regular meetings with the Green Financing Task Force where we socialize what we want to do from the start, and so that nobody's taken by surprise, and transparency where we try to ensure that people who are being affected by this are aware of what's going to happen. So FPIC is really important. You need to do your social baseline, and all these are just part of a carbon project accreditation process. And if you do a Vera CCB, you have to go down to the ground and speak to local communities. So that's what we've been doing for the last 2 years, and so that everybody is on board and nobody's caught off guard. So apart from transparency, I would say number two, you need to all projects should strive to show the additionality involved in your project. You don't want to come up with any it's greenwashing project. So because we want to show to investors that if without that project, certain threats will not be stopped. So proving additionality shouldn't be taken very lightly. You should try our best as much as possible to show that the investor that we are doing something impactful, and nature-based solutions will result in for example, reduction in GHG emissions, protection of a carbon sink, and all those values or numbers that we come up with to show this additionality should be done by professionals. And I think again, I'm trying to put on a marketing shout out here, but if you want to estimate your carbon credits from your forest, MBS is well placed to do that for you. And lastly, I would say you need to show that there is social equity. Funding coming in from these large projects, if it's a voluntary carbon project, funding coming in should trickle down and make sure everybody benefits, not just the government, but also the local communities who are living there. Could be even in and around the area. We should, as much as possible, ensure that the funding supports the local community. So, for example, MBS, as I said, we are not for profit by nature. Any kind of profits from such investments will be recycled to start up new projects, new MBS projects. So that's the principle of how MBS Semporna operates. And again, really happy to hear all the speakers, and very, very hopeful and very honored to be with you all. And again, there's a lot of scope for research, and please, any of you in the audience would like to work on nature-based solutions, there's so many questions to be asked. You're welcome to join me in a postgraduate program here at Sunway. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Prof. Reuben. And Tommy, your brief closing remarks.
Hi. For me, I would say that the cooperation between the different stakeholders, and also within the industries, such as the financial sectors, such as the NGOs, the universities, should all cooperate in this fight against climate change using nature-based solutions on the ground, and also to avoid rivalry among the financial institutions and also the business owners, so that there is a laser-like focus to actually make a difference, because as like I said in my presentation, humans may be the source of some problems, but we can also be the solutions to it. So everyone should be come together, because climate change is a global problem. So everyone is responsible for it. So we shouldn't be having to fight each other to achieve what we want.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tommy, on that very wise and insightful comment. We've come to the end of our presentation of this event. Once again, part two of this event. I'd like to point out that on your Facebook Live comment section, there is a link that will enable you to access all the materials currently available. So the video of the first session, as well as the slide presentations from those presenters. Also, you will be given a Google form link where you can put down your particulars so that you can gain access in the future to the videos, as well as to translated versions of the videos. I believe they're going to be translated into Bahasa Malaysia, which will make them far more accessible as well. So once again, fill out the Google form if you would like to receive these materials in the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, we've come to the end of this two-part event. I myself have gained valuable insights from our distinguished panelists, real events happening on the ground, always good to know. I hope that you have experienced the same. As always, we're extremely grateful to our panelists, distinguished panelists, Thessa from Bank Negara, Malaysia, Professor Reuben from Sunway University in Rimba, Tommy Cheo also from WWF-Malaysia, for giving us their valuable time to share their experiences, their thoughts, and their ideas with us. A big thank you to those working very hard in the background. Apologies for going over time, my bad on the part of the moderator, but a big thank you to New, Lavanya, Watson, and Zara. And finally, to formally close this important event, I am most happy to yield the floor to Sophia Lim, CEO of the Worldwide Fund for Nature Malaysia, for her closing remarks. It's been a pleasure. Thank you and good evening.
Good evening, everyone. I have the pleasure of saying a few words in closing this event, which was jointly organized by WWF-Malaysia and the British High Commission in Malaysia, or BHC. Our event in two parts, the first on Monday, 9th of May, and the second today, forms the first of our ongoing conversations following the launch of the WWF-Malaysia BCG report entitled Securing Our Future, Net Zero Pathways for Malaysia, which was launched at COP26 in Glasgow last year and subsequently followed by a local launch in Taman Tugu, Kuala Lumpur. The idea behind having these conversations following the launch is to continue building on the momentum that the report process created and build partnerships to forge a feasible pathway to this long-term goal of net zero for the country. We are therefore indeed delighted that the first of these conversations is being co-hosted by the British High Commission in Malaysia, and I would like to start by thanking His Excellency Charles Hay for the rousing opening remarks to kick off this event. The High Commission also supported the effort of creating the two videos on nature-based solutions, which were launched as part of this event, and I hope you enjoyed viewing them. Our heartfelt thanks also to our esteemed speakers on both days. Professor Joy Pereira from UKM, who is also a Vice Chair of the IPCC, Mr. Joel Kwong from BCG, Ms. Thessa Vasudevan from Bank Negara Malaysia, Prof. Reuben Clements from Nature-Based Solutions, and our very own Tommy Cheo from WWF Malaysia's Marine Team. And Dr. Gary Teixeira from Climate Governance Malaysia, thank you so very much for your excellent moderation of both parts of the event. Not forgetting the tremendous efforts going on behind the scenes. A big thank you to KL's Sketch Nation for the striking visuals, Miss Ameera for the compelling narration, and all the BHC and WWF Malaysia staff involved in planning these events. Ladies and gentlemen, As we have heard from the presentations, climate change and environmental related disasters are becoming more serious. The intensity and frequency of incidents such as floods and droughts have increased in recent years. The world we live in today is fraught with new challenges that generations before us have not experienced. Climate change threatens food and water security, increases the frequency and intensity of disasters, upending lives, and wreaking economic havoc. Moving forward, resilience needs to be the imperative of development, and we hope our event has convinced you that nature plays a critical role in achieving this. Indeed, it has become all the more important that we achieve a strong outcome for nature at the next major global convention, the Convention on Biological Diversities, COP15 meeting later this year. We need to set a target towards a nature-positive world by 2030 and secure other measures, as mentioned by His Excellency Charles Hay in his opening remarks, as part of the new global biodiversity framework that COP15 should deliver. This, of course, is particularly important in a mega diverse and nature-rich country like Malaysia. I hope you will agree with me that the examples we have heard in today's presentations, as well as the examples in the videos, amply prove that nature-based solutions can serve multiple purposes for the benefit of people and the environment. Hence, Malaysia should advocate for and take strong action to halt and reverse the alarming global and local loss of nature we have witnessed in recent years. At the same time, we must pay heed to Prof. Joy's warning that the science shows that overshooting the 1.5 degree limit could impair nature and her ability to protect us. And we have also heard from Thessa today on the financial risks as posed by nature loss. As you can see, these issues are intrinsically linked. The climate emergency is escalating, and communities all over the world will have to deal with the various inevitable effects. We should strive even harder to meet the 1.5 degree world, and climate mitigation remains as important as ever. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope this webinar has convinced all of us that adaptation action is equally important, as emphasized by Dr. Gary, Prof. Joy, and Joel in the first part of this webinar on Monday, and that nature provides a critical bridge in addressing both of these aspects of climate change and contributes to meeting the SDGs, as showcased by Prof. Reuben and Tommy today. We must prepare and adapt to new and extreme conditions. Higher temperatures, more precipitation, and rising sea levels, among others, are already taking their toll. Government, business, and other leaders must radically rethink how to protect people, the planet, and our future. In effect, how to operate within planetary boundaries. Nature underpins everything and enables societies to thrive. Nature provides a fundamental resource for our economies. So let's protect nature together. Finally, I would like to thank everyone joining these sessions for your active participation and support. And as we say in WWF Malaysia, together, possible. Sekian, terima kasih.